Hi everyone. Just a short one, I think, probably for me today. I stumbled across a comment in a comment section. I don't even remember where, but it annoyed me so much that I didn't even reply to it. I decided I was just gonna do a video. So here goes. The comment is: there is discrimination against men, but there is no systemic sexism. I'm no feminazi, I'm just an individual that understands that nothing occurs in a vacuum, and one must consider the history and widespread systems of power which cater toward men. If you don't understand these concepts, then there's no hope for you. So yeah, this kind of shit just really fucking pisses me off because it displays a complete lack of understanding of what's actually going on and what systems and institutions actually do these days. And it's not because of the blatant redefinition of words. Sexism somehow no longer just means discrimination based on sex. You know, that you have to have some kind of institutionalized or systemic aspect to it. Even by that definition, sexism against men is a thing. Legal statutes, police forces, criminal courts, and prisons are all societal institutions, forming something that I like to call the criminal justice system. This system operates through a complex of legal statutes and operational policies. Because it's a human system, it is influenced by human biases as well. Within the criminal justice system, men are the targets of hostile or negative discrimination compared to women. For the same crime under the same circumstances, men are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be arrested, twice as likely to be charged, more likely to be prosecuted, receive less advantageous offers on average when plea bargaining. They're twice as likely to be convicted of the crime, and more likely to be sentenced to custody, and when they are sentenced to custody, they receive 60% longer sentences than women do. According to numbers crunched in the UK, if men were treated as leniently as women are in that country, 5 out of 6 men currently in UK prisons would not be there. While discrimination based on sex is rare within the actual language of the criminal statutes, that is, most but not all laws are gender neutral, operational policy, an institutional system, and human bias, a human system, are heavily slanted toward holding men more accountable than women when they commit crimes. Whether you choose to call it benevolent sexism against women, or hostile sexism against men, or some combination of both, it's systemic discrimination in both directions, and therefore it's sexist. It has to be, even by SJW standards. You cannot treat person A differently from person B systematically without systematically treating person B different from person A. Whenever a system or institution treats one sex differently from the other, it's necessarily and by definition systemic institutional discrimination against both. Fucking morons. Now, the only way around this little conundrum would be to presume that men are and should be the default and women are the anomaly. That men are the standard by which all people should be treated if the world was not sexist, and that women are the exception to that standard. The gender gap in the criminal justice system is, using the best estimates, 6 times wider than the gap between blacks and whites in the US. We call the smaller of these two gaps racism, systemic discrimination against blacks. We call the larger of these two gaps benevolent sexism against women. And again, the only way you could possibly avoid describing this situation as hostile sexism against men is if you consider men to be the default, the standard, the way all people should be treated. And if that's the case, feminists should be working toward correcting this evidence of sexism against women. But let's look at some feminist efforts to tackle this problem of sexism against women. Back in 2010, a report and an edict was issued from a gender equality committee to judges and magistrates in the UK. They ordered judges to treat women accused of crimes even more leniently than they were already being treated. Quoting from an article that I will leave in the low bar, it told judges that women remain disadvantaged in many public and private areas of their lives. They are underrepresented in the judiciary, parliament, and senior positions across a range of jobs, and there is still a substantial pay gap between men and women. On women accused of crime, the guidance quoted Judge Baroness Hale, the only woman among the 11 at the Supreme Court who describes herself as a soft-line feminist. She's no radical, apparently. She said, "It is now well recognized that a misplaced conception of equality has resulted in some very unequal treatment for women and girls." The fuck does that even mean? That treating women and girls equally results in unequal treatment? How does that even fucking parse in somebody's brain? Judging by this, it seems clear to me that feminists do not think that men represent the default standard by which all people, including women, should be treated in the criminal justice system. If they did, they'd be working very hard to convince legislators and policymakers to treat women as harshly as men when they commit crimes. In reality, however, they have consistently lobbied not to close the gap, but to further widen the gap between men and women when it comes to the criminal justice process. And they've certainly had some modest success in this endeavor, as Madam Justice Hale's fiat from on high demonstrates. Because why? Because not as many women as men are CEOs of major corporations? How does that make any fucking sense? Oh, and just in case you were all wondering if this is strictly a British thing, recently the National Organization for Women in the US issued a statement wherein they asserted that American women are being disproportionately incarcerated. I'll leave the link to that in the low bar too. According to them, quote, "A pipeline is a human-made structure moving substance swiftly and uninterrupted from point A to point B. The school-to-prison pipeline does just that, sending young children of color, disproportionately girls, from school to incarceration. It exists as infrastructure to institutionalized racism, reinforcing the subordination of women of color. Currently, more than 200,000 women are in prisons, and their incarceration rate is double that of men. Women of color suffer disproportionately and are incarcerated at triple the rate of white women." Okay, where do I even begin to take this all apart? So what exactly are they saying here? The school-to-prison pipeline disproportionately affects girls, and that women's incarceration rate is double that of men. Now, you've got some splaining to do, because you seem to have pulled these two claims right out of your ass, hosed them off, and presented them as golden nuggets of truth. According to the Department of Justice's Prisoners in 2013 report from 2003 to 2013, the female prison population remained lower than 150,000, while the male population was never lower than 1.3 million. It's actually the increase in the rate of incarceration that shows some disparity, 2.3% for women versus 0.1% for men. But the actual rates of incarceration remain significantly higher for men. Let me just put it this way. If there were 10 women in prison across the entire US in 2013 and 20 women in prison in the US in 2015, while the male prison population remained at a static, say, 100 million, the incarceration for women rate would be 200% of what it was in 2013, and men's incarceration rate would be just 100% of what it was in 2013. Women's rate of incarceration would have doubled compared to the rate of increase for men. At which point now would claim that women are incarcerated at double the rate of men. Fuck's sake, feminists. You aren't doing much to dispel the myth that women can't math. More than this, if men are the default standard for how everyone should be treated, which is the only way you can claim that this is systemic discrimination against women or not systemic discrimination against men, then this doubling of women's rate of incarceration is a victory for equality. not evidence of systemic hostile discrimination against women. We're simply eliminating the systemic benevolent sexism against women that feminists claim to believe is just as harmful to women as any other form of sexism. A small victory for sure, since men still remain over 90% of the prison population in the US, and all of those bullet points I listed above still apply, if to a marginally lesser degree. But baby steps. We can't fix everything in a day, now can we? So which is it, feminists? Are men the default standard by which everyone, including women, should be treated, in which case you can continue to blather on about how there's no such thing as sexism against men? Because if that's the case, now should be celebrating higher incarceration rates for women rather than complaining. Or are you prepared to admit that men are treated more harshly than they should be by our criminal justice system, just because they're men, and therefore systemic discrimination against men, at least in this context, is actually a thing? Because, you can't have it both ways. Either men are the gold standard and we should be bringing women up or down to their level, or they aren't the gold standard and they're the ones suffering from systemic hostile sexism. And speaking of school-to-prison pipelines, well, you can't have one of those without schools now, can you? Did you know, feminists, that currently girls and women outperform boys and men at every level of education? They get better grades all through primary and secondary school thanks to reforms implemented in the 1990s that allowed girls to better play to their strengths. Things like prioritizing open-ended classwork, collaborative projects, and open book assignments, which girls tend to excel at, while de-emphasizing timed tests, the one area where boys still often outperform girls, particularly in math and science. Did you know that across the Western world, women represent about 60% of university students and are more likely than men to graduate school at all levels, from high school diplomas to advanced university degrees? Did you know that contrary to the National Organization for Women's bogus blog post I quoted, this gender gap is actually wider in minority communities in the US than it is between white men and women? That is, overwhelmingly minority boys and young men who are funneled into the school-to-prison pipeline, while minority women are much more likely than their brothers to attend post-secondary school. Did you know that the educational attainment gap between white men and women is increasing, particularly among poor and working-class whites? How's that for some intersectionality for you? Did you know that in multiple studies across several countries, it's been found that female primary school teachers mark boys' schoolwork down compared to gender-blinded evaluators, and they mark girls' schoolwork up, just based on whether the name at the top of the paper is stereotypically male or stereotypically female. Did you feminists know that by post-secondary, at least in Canada, this bias has not only increased, it exists in both male and female instructors? Last time I checked, an educational institution was, an institution. And the school system was a, one of those system thingies. At the same time, women qualify for 4 times as many private scholarships in the US as men do. The only attempts at gender quotas have been applied to the fields of study, the few of them that are still dominated by men, primarily STEM. Now here we have some actual evidence of men and boys being treated differently compared to a genderless default. A genderless default would be quotas in all areas where one sex dominates. A genderless default would be scholarships that are open to both men and women. A genderless default is a paper with no gender-signifying name written at the top of it. And no, this is not like the infamous experiment with classical musicians auditioning behind a screen, increasing the rate of women being accepted into orchestras. The outcome of that experiment could well, as one fan suggested to me, thank you, Mr. Smith, that could be a result of neutralizing a stereotype threat. Or heck, now that I think about it, it could simply be the result of mitigating stage fright given women's higher tendency toward neuroticism, sensitivity, and apprehension. No, this isn't like that. These are test papers with no names at the top versus test papers with stereotypically male or female names at the top, and female teachers in primary schools deduct marks when the name at the top is a boy's name. And they give bonus points to the work they believe was done by a girl. Both male And female instructors at the university level deduct marks when the name at the top is a man's name and give bonus points to work when the name at the top is a woman's. And this occurs in a school system that has been overhauled over the last 25 or more years to better help girls and women achieve. A school system that apparently needed overhauling because girls were allegedly being shortchanged more than 10 years after they'd achieved parity with men in post-secondary enrollment. The gold standard in schools, at least according to teachers, is girls, and boys are unjustly penalized just because they're boys. Unlike with stereotype threat, the work being graded was the same. The only difference was the name at the top. On top of all of this, follow-out research has indicated that boys know exactly what's going on here. When primary school boys were asked to estimate their grades depending on whether the evaluator would be male, female, or gender blinded, they consistently estimated lower if the evaluator was going to be a female. And their expectations were borne out. Female teachers graded them more poorly than male teachers or teachers who had been gender blinded. Other studies indicate that this suspicion boys have that their female teachers have it in for them demotivates them, while male teachers boost the motivation of both boys and girls to achieve in primary school. Yet 85% of primary school teachers are women feminists, women who discriminate against boys, persistently, pervasively. But hey, don't take my word for any of this institutional sexism against men. Sweden, the Saudi Arabia of feminism, where women represent, like everywhere else in the West, 60% of university students, has decided to abolish affirmative action in post-secondary education. Now, why do you think that they would do that? Quoting from the article that I will link in the low bar. The Swedish government said Tuesday it would abolish affirmative action at universities since the practice has resulted in unjust advantage. Swedish government said Tuesday it would abolish affirmative action at universities since the practice has resulted in male students being given admission priority for several popular programs. The education system should open doors, not slam them in the face of motivated young women, Higher Education Minister Tobias Krantz wrote in an article in Sweden's leading daily Fuck Your Name Swedish paper. Criticism has raged in Sweden recently after male students have been given priority to popular programs where men are underrepresented, in particular medicine, psychology, veterinary, and dentistry faculties. For those programs in particular, there are more women applicants with top grades than men, yet the men are admitted because of the affirmative action rule. Now, isn't that interesting? When men with top marks are denied a place in a male-dominated field to make room for a less qualified woman, that's equality. But when women with top marks are denied a place in a field that is 95% women to make room for less qualified men, then it's sexism against women. Yay, feminism. Go equality. But yeah, none of that's systemic, is it? None of it's institutional. I mean, it's just the casual prejudice on the part of individuals who populate systems of institutions that's reinforced by the official policies and practices of those systems and institutions, policies and practices that still treat women and girls as if they're suffering hostile sexism when the exact opposite is the case. I keep getting reminded of a master's thesis from a feminist at the University of Waterloo, Amy Young. It's quite an interesting read, and I'll link it in the low bar. Through a series of experiments, she found that lay people perceived benevolent sexism by men toward women to be equal treatment, and equal treatment of women by men to be hostile sexism. She showed test subjects a series of vignettes of men and women interacting. Overwhelmingly, when the men treated women better than they treated other men, the subjects judged them less likely to assault their partners, sexually harass a woman, or deny a woman a job opportunity based on sex. When men treated women equally, they were judged to be much more likely to engage in all of these awful behaviors. The only mitigating factor was if it was made clear to the subject that the men were treating women equally for a benevolently sexist reason. To promote women's equality. Of course, these men were still judged to be more hostily sexist than the first group, but they weren't seen as quite as evil shitlords as the second. And here we are, beginning to treat women just a little more equally in the criminal justice system, and feminists are freaking out about it. About how it's sexist against women, and they're either mangling or lying about statistical data to prove it. I mean, we still treat women more gently than we do men, but any closing of that gap, even by a few percentage points, that's somehow translated as misogyny by feminists in the first world. At the same time, we're continuing to widen the already existing education attainment gap, and at the very least, trying to prevent it from closing by continuing to discriminate against men. And this is a victory for equality. But yeah, none of it's systemic or institutional. There's no power behind any of it. It's not like any of this shit is supported or lobbied for by well-funded women's groups that have immense power, or implemented by government institutions that have immense power. None of there's no power behind any of it. Fucking hell. Anyhow, I just wanted to get that off my chest, because this bullshit, this fucking with definitions, we don't even need to argue that their new definitions are fucked. Because by all of their new definitions, men are being discriminated against. There's sexism against men. It's institutional. It's systemic. There's power behind it. There you go. So, anyway, I'll see you next time. Have a good day.